Track 7.
OK, so to finish, I want to look at the resources available for researching UK census information for the essay you'll be writing at the end of this module. There are many resources for the study of the civilian population and family history out there, ranging from public to academic to commercial. Some are available for the public to access free of charge, whilst others are only available by payment of fees or restricted to academics and subject to registration. Some are more appropriate to family or genealogical investigation, others to historical population research. So, if we start at the beginning of the list on your handout, you'll see firstly there is the Family Records Centre based in central London. The centre and their website are available to anyone in the country who has an interest in researching demographic data. Their work might be useful to give you an overview of the general sorts of data and services available. Unfortunately, you do have to pay a registration charge of £20 for a year's access to their material. The next resource on the list is Genes Reunited, which is mainly for people who want to find out more about their ancestors. There are some good interactive tools on this website, especially the one which shows you how to manipulate the National Census Association's statistical data. Although Genes Reunited is very useful, it is used by a range of businesses and therefore accessing the site will cost you. Now, the third item on the handout is the National Census Association, which contains the most up-to-date data as it's compiled from official government census data every 10 years. Both companies and individuals are able to access all their resources without payment, so this may be a good place to start your research. Finally, I'd just like to draw your attention to two journals at the bottom of the handout. The first one, Journal of Historical Migration, is not actually a journal, but a collection of articles on a website. Anyway, you might like to take a look at it because it has several articles on the importance of recording census data from a historical research perspective. This site is available to the general public, so you don't have to pay or register. The other one, the Journal of Social Demography, is only available using your university online journal's login details, as it can only be accessed by those studying or researching in higher education. Right, well, that should be enough reading for you.
Track 8. Today, I'd like to continue from last week's lecture by looking at what helps people successfully integrate into a new culture. Whereas the reasons for migration are nowadays fairly easy to identify and largely related to employment opportunities or political instability, the factors behind being able to adapt to the new culture and create a new life are considerably more complex. Let's start with an overview of the issues as shown on this diagram. Starting on the left of the diagram, there are two lists of factors, internal and external. It's important to notice that the internal factors, in other words, those based on an individual's personality, are divided into positive factors, trusting others and acknowledging that people are different, and negative, being afraid and being suspicious of people. You might think that the list of negative factors would include discrimination, but it doesn't because discrimination comes under the larger category of fear. Now, what you should also notice is that the external factors are not labelled in this way. It's much more difficult to know how to measure the effects of external factors and whether they actually are external or not. The influence of family relationships, climate, beliefs and values, and the ability to communicate in the language of the new culture have wide-ranging effects which are difficult to measure and can distort any research. Now focus on the centre of the diagram, and you'll see this phrase, coping strategies. This is important because studies have shown that people who integrate well into a new culture, and that is any culture by the way, are those who have eradicated any negativity and made positive choices, and adopted coping strategies such as observing people and taking time to listen and ask questions in order to diminish the effects of culture shock. What we have observed is that people who demonstrate positive coping strategies, such as observing, listening and questioning, end up by understanding the host culture better and integrating quicker and more successfully. However, those who choose to be critical of the differences and therefore react negatively to the host culture are likely to have increased feelings of alienation. This alienation can tail off and become the beginning of acceptance if a person has some positive experiences, but it usually deteriorates quickly into isolation. Track 9.
Many people have immigrated to Britain and become citizens over the last 200 years, and in today's lecture I'd like to look at the various laws or Acts of Parliament introduced to deal with those people who came to live in Britain. In 1793 there was the Aliens Act, which the British government introduced to control the number of refugees fleeing to Britain to escape the revolution in France. Compared to today, when refugees have to complete a long and complicated application process before arrival, in 1793, all that was required by the authorities was that individuals had to register at the port where they arrived. The collection of personal information started in 1844 with the Naturalisation Act, which was updated in 1870. The main difference in the 1870 Act was that applicants who wanted to stay in Britain had to have served the Crown or to have lived in the country for at least 5 years before being considered. Both these acts allowed the government to control the number of people coming into the country. These changes were fairly insignificant regarding people's freedoms and the amount of state intervention involved. However, in the 20th century, this began to change. The Alien Registration Act was introduced in 1914, and when the First World War broke out, all aliens over the age of 16 had to register at local police stations, be of good character, and demonstrate a working knowledge of English. The reason for this act was to create a feeling of patriotism among migrant communities and also to stop spies from Europe infiltrating the country. And after the Second World War, the meaning of British nationality was redefined again, this time to encourage residents from British colonies to come to Britain to help rebuild the country. This was the British Nationality Act of 1948. The condition was that potential migrants had to demonstrate that they wanted to work and were fit and healthy. Finally, there was the Commonwealth Immigration Act of 1962. Legislation was passed to restrict the number of Commonwealth immigrants to Britain. Although many people still wanted to come to Britain to obtain good jobs, the Act now meant applicants had to get work permits, which were given mostly to skilled immigrants such as doctors. In the next session, I want to look at more contemporary acts. For instance, the one that was...
Track 10. Section 4. You will hear a lecture on immigration patterns. First, you will have 20 seconds to look at questions 1 to 10. Now listen carefully and answer questions 1 to 10. This morning, I'd like to focus on New York as a model for understanding immigration patterns in relation to national rather than international change. Firstly, it is important to understand that migration patterns are primarily affected by the rules of immigration, which determine the conditions of entry. After that, internal changes can affect patterns considerably. To highlight my first point, let's study this diagram of Ellis Island and the process of admitting immigrants in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Upon arrival at Ellis Island, people underwent a series of examinations and questions before being allowed to enter the US. First of all, there was a medical inspection to ensure the immigrants were not bringing in any contagious diseases. Anyone who did not pass the medical examination was refused entry to New York and sent home on the next available ship. If the examination was passed, immigrants were required to take a further examination. this time a legal examination to establish whether they had any criminal convictions. After this, immigrants were able to change currency and purchase tickets for onward rail travel from New York. Having completed this simple process, immigrants were told to wait. This wait could be as long as 5 hours before boarding a ferry to take them to New York City. This simple system allowed millions of immigrants to enter the US and is largely responsible for the ethnic makeup of the city today. Even though the immigrants themselves may have had a variety of reasons for deciding to migrate, it was only possible because of US national immigration laws. Moving on to the second point, how changes within a country can have as much or more of an effect than those outside the country, various parts of New York have changed radically in their ethnic makeup over the last 200 years. Communities became wealthier, governments introduced new laws, and employment opportunities came and went. These factors affect where people choose to live or force them to move to somewhere different. For example, most people think that the population has changed in Manhattan due to the rise of its importance as a financial trade center, which is true to some extent. But, like the Ellis Island example, a change in politics, namely a change of mayor, allowed the city to boom as a financial centre, and this resulted in different types of people moving to the area. Brooklyn is an interesting example too, and we'll be looking at it as our case study later in the lecture. Whereas it used to be a predominantly working-class area of the city and therefore attracted unskilled migrant workers, nowadays its fame as a centre for up-and-coming artists and musicians means it has attracted a new and much more diverse population of middle-class residents. Finally, Queens has shown a dramatic change in its population over the last 50 years due to the airports there. This means that the number of airline staff living in the area has dramatically increased and changed the nature of the local population. Finally, I'd like to use Brooklyn as a case study of local change. Brooklyn's population has changed significantly over the years, and this can most easily be seen in its economic activity. Tracing the Brooklyn industries back from the current financial services companies to manufacturing in the 1950s to shipbuilding in the 1900s, we can map this onto average wages and therefore the type and class of resident. And this has affected the population density too, which has been steadily increasing over the past 100 years from 1.5 million in 1900 through to 2 million in the middle of the 20th century to the 2.3 million inhabitants today. In fact, Brooklyn is suffering from considerable overpopulation now. But this large population increase was due not to employment, but the building of the subway, which linked Brooklyn to other areas of New York. Prior to this, at the beginning of the 20th century, the only way of transportation was the Brooklyn Bridge. Another factor, which traditionally increases the desire for the middle classes to live in a particular place, is the extent and type of local heritage, especially for those people with young children. In Brooklyn, this is evident in the increase in population after the construction of Coney Island. The modern-day equivalent of this is the restoration of Prospect Park, which has brought more middle-income families into the area. That is the end of the listening test. In the exam, you will have half a minute to check your answers.